"I am pregnant with your husband's baby, you tacky old woman." That is what my son's fiancée whispered into my ear while the rest of the table laughed at someone else's joke, while the candles burned, while my husband refilled his wine glass 3 feet away and did not look at either of us. I laughed out loud, the kind of laugh that surprises even the person making it, and I said, "Don't worry, dear. 31 years I had spent building a life with that man. $40,000 I had once quietly loaned this very girl when her car broke down, never asking for it back. But I was not worried, because something in her voice had already told me she had made a mistake she did not yet understand. Weeks later, I gave her a surprise. And trust me, she never saw it coming. My name does not matter yet. What matters is that on the night this happened, I was 68 years old, sitting at the head of a table I had sat 1,000 times before, surrounded by people I loved more than my own breath. And one of them had just tried to detonate my life with a single sentence whispered like a secret between girlfriends. I did not flinch. I had learned, over 6 decades of living, that the women who survive are the ones who do not let their faces tell the truth before they are ready to. Let me tell you who I was before that night, because you cannot understand what I did afterward without first understanding what I had already given. I married Robert Whitfield when I was 23 years old, in a small Methodist church with peeling white paint and a pastor who stumbled over our names because he had married 3 other couples that same Saturday. We had nothing. Robert was an apprentice electrician, and I was a secretary at an insurance office downtown, typing letters on a machine that jammed every 4th line. We rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and on cold nights, the hum of the dryers below was the only heat we had. I did not mind. I was young, and I believed that love multiplied whatever you had, the way yeast multiplies dough, the way patience multiplies a small wage into something that could one day be called a life. For the first 10 years, we built everything together, brick by brick, the way people used to. Robert started his own electrical contracting business in our garage, and I kept the books at the kitchen table after my regular shift ended because we could not afford to pay anyone else to do it. I learned how to read a balance sheet the way other women learned to read recipes. Out of necessity, out of love, out of the quiet understanding that if I did not do it, no one would. We had our son, Daniel, when I was 28. We had our daughter, Carol, when I was 31. I worked through both pregnancies until the week before each birth because we needed the income. And I went back within 6 weeks because the business could not survive without someone managing the money while Robert was out wiring houses from dawn until dark. By the time we turned 50, Robert's company employed 11 men and had a small office on Callaway Street with his name on the door in gold letters. I had stopped working outside the home by then, but I never stopped working. I ran the books, I managed the payroll, I smoothed over the disputes with difficult clients, I hosted the Christmas parties that kept his crew loyal year after year. When people complimented Robert on his success, he would smile and say, "I owe it all to Margaret." And for many years, I believed he meant it. There were years, particularly in the middle of our marriage, when the business nearly failed. And I want to tell you about those years too, because they explain something about why I was so slow to suspect what I eventually had to face. When Daniel was 7 and Carol was 4, Robert lost a major contract to a competitor who underbid him by a margin that should have been impossible. And for 8 months, we lived on savings that dwindled faster than either of us wanted to admit out loud. I took in the alterations work then too, years before I ever did it for Daniel's tuition, sewing late into the night after the children were asleep. And I remember Robert sitting across from me at that same kitchen table with his head in his hands, saying he had failed us, that he should never have left his steady job at the utility company to chase something uncertain. I told him then what I believed completely, that we were not failing. We were simply in the middle of a hard chapter, and hard chapters end if you keep turning the pages. I do not regret saying it. I do not even regret believing it. But I think of that night often now, because it was the first of many moments when I positioned myself as the load-bearing wall of our marriage without ever once putting my own name on the title. By the time the children were in middle school, the business had recovered, and then some, and Robert began to take on a kind of public confidence that I found, at the time, attractive. He spoke at the Regional Contractors Association dinner. He was quoted in the local paper about commercial wiring standards. He became, in our small corner of the world, a respected man, a man other men deferred to, A man whose wife was expected to stand beside him at functions in tasteful dresses and say very little of substance, which I did, gladly, because I did not yet understand that respectability and partnership are not always the same thing. I want to be fair to the man I married for 3 decades. He was not cruel in those years. He was, I believe, genuinely grateful for what I did, in the way a person is grateful for the sun without ever quite remembering to thank it by name. Gratitude without acknowledgement has a way of curdling slowly into entitlement, and I think that is closer to what happened to Robert than any single dramatic betrayal. The Lakeshore Inn was not the beginning. It was simply the place where decades of quiet entitlement finally found its most convenient expression. I tell you all of this not to brag about a marriage, but because you need to understand the scale of what I had built before I tell you how easily someone tried to take it from me with a whisper at a dinner table. Daniel grew into a good man, or so I believed. He went to college on a partial scholarship that I supplemented by taking in alterations work 3 nights a week for 2 years, hemming prom dresses and wedding gowns until my fingers ached, because I refused to let him graduate with the kind of debt that follows a person like a shadow for 20 years. He became a structural engineer, steady and serious, the kind of son who called every Sunday and remembered his parents' anniversary without being reminded. For most of his adult life, I was proud of him in the quiet, constant way a mother is proud of a son who has simply turned out decent, which is rarer than people think. 2 years before the night at that dinner table, Daniel met Vanessa Cole at a conference in Chicago. She was 26 then, a marketing consultant with a quick smile and an even quicker way of making herself the center of every room she entered. The first time I met her, she complimented my home in a tone that somehow also managed to suggest it was smaller than what she was used to. The second time, she asked me, in front of Robert, what my vision was for my retirement, as though I were a corporation in need of restructuring rather than a woman who had simply lived a long and careful life. I noticed these things. I filed them away the way I have always filed things away. Quietly, without comment, the way you press a flower between the pages of a book you do not expect to open again for a long time. I noticed other things too, small things, the kind of details a woman who has run a household for 30 years learns to track without consciously deciding to. Robert began doing his own laundry separately from mine, something he had never once done in 3 decades, claiming his new gym clothes needed a different detergent. He started keeping a second phone charger in his truck, then a third in his office, as though the device itself had become something he needed access to at all times, in all places, the way a man keeps an inhaler if he has asthma. He began coming home later on Thursdays specifically, always Thursdays, always with the same explanation about a supplier meeting that ran long. And when I once mentioned, lightly, that I might come along to meet this supplier myself since I still technically managed half the company's vendor relationships, he changed the subject so quickly and so completely that I remember sitting very still afterward, turning the moment over in my mind the way you turn over a stone in a creek bed, looking for what might be hiding underneath. There was also the matter of his mother's wedding ring, which he had inherited after she passed 11 years ago, and which had sat untouched in the lockbox in our closet for the entirety of those 11 years, because Robert always said sentimentally that it belonged to no one until our future grandchildren's wedding day. 4 months before that dinner, I went looking for a passport in that lockbox and discovered the ring was gone. When I asked him about it, he said, too quickly, that he had taken it to be appraised and cleaned, a process that should have taken a single afternoon, but that, as far as I could tell, never produced a ring that ever returned to that lockbox again. I did not ask twice. I simply noted it, the way I noted everything else, and placed it in the growing, silent ledger I was keeping in the back of my mind, a ledger no one else could see, the only kind of accounting I had left that was entirely my own. There was one particular afternoon, about a month before the dinner, that I have returned to many times since, turning it over the way you turn over a photograph looking for a detail you missed the first time. I had come home early from a hair appointment that had been canceled, and I let myself in through the side door, the quiet one that does not announce itself the way the front door does, and I heard Robert's voice from the den, low, warm, in a way I had not heard him sound in months, the particular warmth a person reserves for someone they are trying not to disappoint. I know, he was saying. Just a little longer. She doesn't suspect anything, I promise you. She's not exactly looking for trouble. That's never been her way. A pause, and then, quieter, almost tender, in a way that turned my stomach more than any anger could have. "You worry too much. Margaret trusts me. She always has." I stood very still in the hallway, my coat still on, my purse still over my shoulder, and I let those words settle into me the way cold water settles into a stone left out overnight. Margaret trusts me. She always has. He said it not with guilt, not with the heaviness of a man confessing a sin even to himself, but with a kind of casual confidence, the confidence of a man who had correctly calculated, across 11 months, that my trust was a resource he could spend freely because I had never once given him reason to believe I might count it. I did not announce myself. I backed quietly out the side door, walked around the block twice in the cold, and came back in through the front door 10 minutes later, calling out a cheerful hello as though I had just arrived home. My heart pounding so loudly, I was certain he must be able to hear it from across the house. He came out of the den smiling, asked how my appointment went, and I told him the salon had a scheduling mix-up, and that was that. He never knew. I let him believe, for one more month, that his calculation about my trust remained correct, because I understood, even then, even before I had a single piece of paper to prove anything, that the moment he knew I suspected him was the moment he would stop being careless. And a careless man is so much easier to catch than a careful one. I think about that afternoon often, the particular discipline it required to walk back through my own front door and smile at a man who had just, unknowingly, confirmed every fear I had been too proud to fully voice, even to myself. I do not think I had ever, in 31 years of marriage, done anything that required more strength than that 10-minute walk around the block in the cold, composing my face, deciding, with total clarity, exactly what I was going to do next. When her car broke down 18 months before the dinner, a transmission failure at $4,000, she came to me directly, not to Daniel. She sat across from me at this very table, twisted her hands together, and said she did not want to burden Daniel with money trouble so early in their relationship that she was embarrassed, that she would pay me back the moment her next consulting contract came through. I wrote her a check for the full amount that same afternoon. I never told Daniel. I never asked for the money back. I considered it an investment in his happiness, the same way I had considered the alterations work an investment in his education. That money was never repaid. I want you to remember that detail because it becomes important later. Robert, in those same 2 years, began to change in ways I told myself were simply the ordinary erosions of age. He started going to the gym 4 mornings a week, something he had never done in 30 years of marriage, coming home with a new vocabulary of supplements and personal trainers that sat oddly in the mouth of a man who had spent his whole working life building things with his hands rather than sculpting his body for an audience I could not yet identify. He bought new clothes that he had never asked my opinion on, which was unusual because I had always been the one who picked out his shirts, who knew his sizes better than he did, who had stood beside him in department store fitting rooms for 3 decades offering opinions he had always, until then, genuinely wanted. He began taking his phone into the bathroom with him, locking the door, a habit that had never existed in our house before and that I noticed within the first week, the way you notice a single crooked picture frame in a hallway you have walked down 10,000 times. I did not confront him. I want to be honest with you about why. Part of it was fear. The ordinary fear of a woman who has built her entire identity around a marriage and does not know who she becomes without it. But the larger part, the part I am less ashamed to admit now, was strategy. I had learned, in 31 years of marriage and 68 years of living, that confrontation without proof is simply an invitation for someone to lie to your face more convincingly the second time. I decided, quietly, in the privacy of my own mind, that if something was happening, I would not discover it through accusation. I would discover it through patience. So when Vanessa leaned in at that dinner table, her lips close enough to my ear that I could smell the wine on her breath, and whispered the words that should have shattered me, some small, cold, clear part of my mind was almost relieved. Not glad. Never glad. But relieved the way you are relieved when a doctor finally names the pain you have been feeling for months. At least now I knew what I was dealing with. "I am pregnant with your husband's baby, you tacky old woman," I laughed. I want you to understand that the laugh was not performance, not entirely. Some of it was genuine shock finding the only exit it could find in that moment. But underneath the laugh, my mind had already begun moving, the way it used to move when a client tried to dispute an invoice that I knew, with certainty, was correct down to the last dollar. I did not need to argue with her in that moment. I needed information. I needed proof. I needed time. "Don't worry, dear," I said, and I patted her hand, the way you might pat the hand of a child who has just told you something wildly improbable, something you intend to verify later in private. Then I turned back to the table and asked Carol about her garden, and the dinner continued as though nothing at all had happened, while across from me, my husband cut his steak and did not once meet my eyes. That night, after everyone had gone home and Robert had fallen asleep in front of the television the way he always did, I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea going cold in front of me, and I made a decision that would change the rest of my life. I was not going to scream. I was not going to cry where anyone could see me. I was going to find out the truth, all of it, before I said another word to anyone in that family. And then, when I knew everything, I was going to act. The first call I made, the next morning, was to Dorothy Kane. Dorothy had lived 3 doors down from us for 22 years. She was 71, a retired family court judge who had spent 35 years on the bench listening to people destroy each other over money, custody, and pride, and there was very little in human behavior that could surprise her anymore. We had grown close over the decades, the way neighbors sometimes do, trading garden vegetables and holiday cookies, sitting on her back porch on summer evenings with glasses of iced tea, talking about everything and nothing. She was the only person I trusted enough to tell the whole truth to before I had the proof to back it up. I walked over that morning still in my robe, and Dorothy took one look at my face and put the kettle on without asking why. "Sit," she said. "Tell me." I told her everything. The gym, the new clothes, the locked bathroom door, the missing ring, the Thursdays, the whisper at the dinner table. Dorothy listened without interrupting, the way she must have listened to 1,000 testimonies from the bench, her face giving away nothing until I had finished, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug she had owned since before I knew her. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I began to worry I had somehow disappointed her, that perhaps even Dorothy, who had seen the worst of human nature professionally for 35 years, found my situation somehow beneath the gravity I had assigned it. "Margaret," she said finally, "do you know how many women sat in front of my bench over the years and told me, almost word for word, the story you just told me? Hundreds, maybe more than that. And do you know what almost all of them had in common, the ones who walked out of my courtroom with what they actually deserved versus the ones who walked out with scraps?" I shook my head. "Timing," Dorothy said. "Not courage. Not even the truth, exactly, though the truth mattered. Timing. The women who won were the ones who found out everything before anyone knew they were looking. The ones who lost were almost always the ones who got angry too early, who said something in the heat of a single discovered text message, who gave their husbands or their husbands' families weeks or months to clean up evidence, hide assets, rehearse their stories, get their own lawyers retained before the wife even knew she needed one. Anger is information for the other side, Margaret. It tells them exactly how much you know and exactly how fast they need to move to outrun you. She poured more tea before continuing. "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. Do you want to save this marriage, or do you want to know the truth, no matter what the truth costs you?" I thought about that question longer than I expected to. "The truth," I said. "I have spent 31 years building a life on what I believed was true. I will not spend whatever years I have left living on a lie just because the truth is inconvenient." Dorothy nodded slowly, as though I had passed some kind of test. "Then here is what you do. You do not confront him. You do not confront her. You gather everything first. Financial records, communications, anything that establishes a timeline. Because in my 35 years on the bench, I watched more good women lose everything. Not because they were wrong, but because they spoke before they had proof, and the people they accused had time to clean up after themselves. You move like water, Margaret. Quiet, patient. Find every crack before you let anyone know you are looking. And one more thing." She reached over and took my hand, her grip surprisingly firm for a woman her age. "Whatever you find, whatever it costs you, you are going to come out the other side of this still being exactly who you have always been. Don't let anyone, especially yourself, convince you otherwise." She gave me the name of a private investigator she had worked with for years during contentious custody cases, a retired detective named Frank Alvarez who, she said, was discreet, thorough, and utterly unbothered by other people's secrets. She also gave me the name of her own estate attorney, a sharp young woman named Priya Nair, in case, Dorothy said carefully, you find you need to protect what is yours before anyone else has the chance to touch it. Before I left her porch that morning, Dorothy added one more thing, almost as an afterthought, though I have come to understand it was anything but. Keep a journal, she said. Write down everything you notice, every date, every detail, starting today. Not for the lawyers, necessarily, though it may help them too. For you. Because 3 weeks from now, when this is finished, you are going to want to remember exactly how strong you had to be to get through it. And it is easier to remember strength when you've written it down in real time, rather than trying to reconstruct it afterward through the fog of how it all turned out. I did keep that journal in a plain spiral notebook I bought at the pharmacy that same afternoon, and I still have it, tucked in the drawer of my nightstand in the smaller house with the garden. I do not read it often. But I know it is there, page after page of a woman's careful, unglamorous handwriting, documenting the exact moment she stopped waiting to be told the truth and decided, instead, to go and find it herself. I drove to Frank Alvarez's office that same afternoon, a modest space above a dry cleaner's on the east side of town, and I sat across from a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a notepad, and I told him I needed to know, with documentation, whether my husband was having an affair, and if so, with whom and for how long. I have a name already, I told him. Vanessa Cole, my son's fiancée. Frank did not blink. I imagine, in his line of work, very little made him blink anymore. I'll need 3 weeks, he said. Maybe less. People who think they're being careful are usually the easiest to catch because they get comfortable. He asked me a series of questions I had not anticipated. Robert's typical schedule, the make and model of his truck, whether he had any standing weekly commitments, gym memberships, golf games, anything with a predictable rhythm. I answered each one with the kind of precision that surprised even me, the precision of a woman who had, without realizing it, been quietly cataloging her husband's life for months already. A week and a half into the investigation, Frank called and asked me to meet him at a diner 2 towns over, somewhere neither Robert nor anyone in our social circle would recognize either of us. He slid a manila folder halfway across the table, not yet open. Before I show you this, he said, I want to prepare you. What's in here isn't proof of an affair yet. It's proof of a pattern. The affair itself, the part you can take to a lawyer, that's still a week or 2 out. But I think you should see this now, because you struck me as someone who'd rather know things in pieces than be ambushed by all of it at once. He opened the folder. Inside were surveillance photographs, time-stamped, of Robert's truck parked outside the Lakeshore Inn on 2 separate occasions already, along with a photograph of Robert and Vanessa standing close together in a parking lot outside a restaurant downtown, her hand resting on his forearm in a way that no professional or familial relationship could reasonably explain. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I want to tell you that I felt rage in that moment, and some part of me did somewhere underneath the surface. But what I mostly felt, sitting in that vinyl diner booth with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, was a strange, hollow confirmation, the feeling of a suspicion finally being permitted to stop apologizing for itself. Take your time, Frank said. There's no rush on what you do with this. The folder isn't finished yet. I'd recommend waiting for the full picture before you act on any of it. I nodded, folded the photograph back into the folder, and drove home in silence, rehearsing the entire way the particular calm I would need to maintain at dinner that evening, the calm of a woman who already knew far more than the man across the table from her could possibly imagine. While Frank worked, I did my own quiet work at home. I want to explain something about money to you, because money is not vulgar. Money is not unromantic. Money is simply the architecture that holds up everything else in a life. And a woman who does not understand the architecture of her own life is a woman standing in a house she does not actually own. For 31 years, I had managed Robert's business books. I knew every account, every line item, every habit of his spending down to the dollar. What I had never done, foolishly, was separate enough of what was mine from what was ours. I called Priya Nair the day after I met with Frank. She was younger than I expected, perhaps 35, with a calm, direct manner that I liked immediately. Her office was small but immaculate, with a single framed quote on the wall that read, simply, "Document everything." I told her everything. The marriage, the business, the suspicion, the loan I had given Vanessa that was never repaid, all of it. "First," Priya said, "we are not going to wait for proof of the affair to protect your financial position. Infidelity and asset protection are two separate legal questions, and you are entitled to safeguard what is rightfully yours, regardless of what your husband has or has not done. Do you have access to a portion of the marital funds that you could move into an account solely in your name without raising immediate suspicion?" I did. Over the following 10 days, I quietly transferred a portion of our joint savings, money I had personally earned and managed for 3 decades, into a new account at a different bank across town, one Robert had no relationship with and no reason to check. I did this in small, unremarkable increments, the way you might withdraw cash for a renovation project, never enough at once to trigger a conversation. Priya also helped me locate and copy the deed to our home, the business incorporation documents, and the most recent valuation of Robert's company, all of which I would need regardless of what Frank discovered. "There's something else you should understand," Priya told me during our second meeting, spreading a series of documents across her desk. "In this state, a business built during the marriage, even one that carries only your husband's name on the door, is considered marital property and your direct, documented contributions to its growth. The bookkeeping, the client management, the payroll you ran for 30 years. Those aren't sentimental details. Those are legal contributions to the value of that company." Most women in your position don't realize how much leverage they actually have because they've spent so many years being told, implicitly, that their work was simply what a good wife does, rather than what it actually was, which was unpaid labor that built real, measurable equity. She tapped a finger against a printed valuation. "Robert's company is worth, conservatively, just under $2 million today. You helped build every cent of that. I want you to remember that number. Margaret, the next time anyone in that family suggests you should be grateful for whatever you're offered, I want to pause here and tell you something, because I think it matters. I did not do any of this out of vengeance. Vengeance is loud, and it announces itself, and it usually burns the person holding the match as badly as the person it is aimed at. What I was doing was something quieter and, I believe, more honorable. I was simply refusing, for the first time in 31 years, to be the last person in my own life to find out what was happening in it." 3 weeks later, almost to the day, Frank Alvarez called and asked me to come to his office. He laid out a manila folder on the desk between us, and inside, it was everything. Photographs of Robert's truck parked outside the Lakeshore Inn on 4 separate occasions over the previous 2 months. A receipt, obtained through means Frank did not elaborate on and I did not ask about, showing a room charged to Robert's credit card. A card I did not know existed, opened 8 months earlier and mailed to his office instead of our home. Bank records showing small, recurring transfers from that same card to an account in Vanessa's name, never more than $300 at a time, always labeled in a way that would look unremarkable to anyone but a woman who had spent 30 years reading financial statements for a living. Text messages, screenshotted from a phone Robert had foolishly left logged into a cloud backup account he had set up years ago and forgotten about, an account Frank had legal access to because, as it turned out, it was technically registered under my name from when I had originally set up our family's shared photo storage a decade prior. The messages between Robert and Vanessa spanned back 11 months. They were not vague. They were not ambiguous. They detailed hotel meetings, financial transfers, dressed up in the messages as gifts, a conversation about Robert's mother's wedding ring, given to Vanessa 4 months earlier as what one message called "something to remember this by," and, near the most recent exchanges, a conversation about a pregnancy. I read every page in silence. Frank sat across from me, quiet, professional, occasionally sliding the box of tissues an inch closer without comment. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a woman in my position to weep over evidence like this, and I did not. What I felt was something colder and, in its own way, more useful. A confirmation, a closing of the loop, the final piece of a puzzle I had already mostly assembled in my mind. The ring, I remember thinking, with a strange, distant clarity. 11 years in a lockbox, waiting for a grandchild's wedding day, and he gave it to her like a party favor. But there was one more piece of information in that folder that I had not expected, one detail that changed the entire shape of what I would eventually do. Buried in the messages, dated 6 weeks before the dinner where Vanessa whispered her threat to me, was a text from Vanessa to Robert that read, "The timeline doesn't work for you being the father, and you know it." Daniel was traveling for his cousin's conference the whole week it would have happened. We need to be careful what we say. I sat with that sentence for a long time. I am not a doctor, and I do not pretend to understand every detail of human biology with precision, but I understood enough. And Frank, who had handled dozens of paternity-adjacent investigations in his career, confirmed what I suspected. Vanessa was not entirely certain whose child she was carrying. There was a real possibility, perhaps even a likelihood by her own admission in writing, that the baby was Daniel's after all, not Robert's, and that she had used the affair and the pregnancy and the cruel whisper at my dinner table as some kind of leverage, some kind of insurance policy, dangled in front of an old woman she assumed would be too frightened, too proud, or too foolish to ever investigate. Further, she had bet on my silence. She had looked at a 68-year-old woman in a modest cardigan, sitting at the head of a table she had set with her own hands for 30 years, and she had decided that woman was an easy mark. That was, I came to understand, the single greatest miscalculation of her young life. I did not go home angry that night. I went home with a plan. Over the following 2 weeks, I did 3 things, methodically, without telling a single member of my family what I knew. First, I met again with Priya Nair, and together we finalized the separation of my assets in a way that would withstand any legal challenge. I did not yet file for divorce. That would come, but timing mattered, and Priya was insistent that the order of operations would determine how much I walked away with. We restructured my portion of the business equity, documented every dollar I had personally contributed to its growth over 3 decades, and prepared the paperwork that would, when the time came, ensure I was not simply a wife asking for half of something, but a co-builder reclaiming what had always been rightfully mine. Second, I scheduled a private meeting with Daniel, alone, at a coffee shop far from the house, where no one we knew was likely to see us. He arrived in his work clothes, having taken a long lunch he did not explain to his office, and he knew, from the tone of my voice on the phone the day before, that whatever I wanted to discuss was not casual. "You're scaring me a little, Mom," he said, settling into the chair across from me, wrapping both hands around a coffee he did not drink. "You've never asked to meet me alone like this." I told him, gently, but without softening the truth, that I had reason to believe Vanessa's pregnancy timeline was uncertain, and that I believed, strongly, he deserved clarity before he married anyone or signed his name to a single document tying his future to hers. I watched my son's face go through something I had not seen since he was a teenager catching his first real heartbreak. Disbelief, then a terrible, dawning understanding, then a kind of quiet fury that frightened me a little because I recognized it. It was the same fury I had been carrying for 3 weeks, simply wearing a younger face. "How do you know this?" he asked. "Mom, how would you possibly know something like that?" "I've been paying closer attention than anyone realized," I told him, which was true, and which was also as much as I was prepared to say in that moment. "I need you to trust me, not blindly. I would never ask that of you. But I need 2 more weeks before I can show you everything, and I need you to not say anything to Vanessa in the meantime, no matter how hard that is." He was quiet for a long time, turning his cup in slow circles on the table. "Is there more than the timeline?" he asked finally, and something in the careful way he asked it told me he had already begun to suspect there was. "There's more," I said. "I'm not going to tell you the rest until I can show you proof, because I won't have you carrying half a truth around for 2 weeks. That's not fair to you." "I need proof," Daniel said, "not suspicion. Proof. You'll have it," I told him. "I am asking you to trust me for 2 more weeks. Can you do that?" He could. My son, for all his faults, had never once doubted my word in 34 years, and he did not start that day. Before he left, he reached across the table and took my hand, the way he used to when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "Whatever this is," he said, "I already know you wouldn't be doing it unless it mattered. I just hope I'm wrong about whatever you think you found." He was not wrong to hope that. He was, unfortunately, also not wrong to have suspected it. Third, And this was the piece that required the most delicacy, I arranged, through Vanessa's own obstetrician's office. A connection I made not through deception, but through a cousin of Dorothy's who worked as a nurse practitioner in the same medical group, to confirm that Vanessa had, in fact, already undergone a non-invasive prenatal paternity test 8 weeks into her pregnancy. This was not uncommon information to access. Expectant mothers discuss these things with family, and Vanessa had mentioned the test, in passing, to Daniel weeks earlier, never imagining he would mention it to his mother, and never imagining his mother would quietly confirm, through entirely legal and proper channels available to a concerned family member listed on the same insurance policy, that the results existed and were sitting, unopened, by anyone but the lab, in a sealed file. I did not open that file myself. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters morally as much as it matters legally. What I did was far simpler and far more devastating in its simplicity. I arranged for the results to be revealed at the moment of my choosing, in front of everyone who needed to see them, rather than allowing Vanessa to continue controlling the narrative in private, doling out fear to an old woman one whispered threat at a time. I planned a dinner. I told the family it was to celebrate Robert's upcoming retirement from active oversight of the business, a retirement that was, in fact, entirely true, because Priya and I had quietly restructured the company in a way that would become very relevant within the hour the dinner began. I told Daniel and Carol it was a family celebration. I told Vanessa, when she called to ask what she should wear, that it was nothing fancy, just family, just us, the way it had always been. In the days leading up to that dinner, I prepared the house the way I always had for family gatherings, polishing the good silver, ironing the tablecloth my own mother had given me as a wedding gift 45 years earlier, choosing the roast and the side dishes with the same care I had brought to every family dinner for 3 decades. I want to tell you that there was something almost meditative in that preparation, a kind of ritual calm before what I knew was coming. I was not nervous. I had spent 3 weeks being nervous, in the early mornings before Frank's calls, in the long afternoons waiting for Priya's documents, and somewhere in that waiting, the nervousness had burned itself down into something steadier, something closer to resolve. She arrived that evening wearing a deep green dress, and a smile that I now understood, with total clarity, was a performance she had been giving for 2 years. Robert arrived in the new shirt I had not picked out for him. Daniel arrived early, as I had asked him to, and sat beside me in the kitchen while I finished the roast, his jaw tight, his hands still. "Are you ready?" I asked him. "I've been ready for 2 weeks, Mom," he said. I just didn't know it yet. Carol arrived last, breezing in with a bottle of wine and no idea what was waiting for her, kissing my cheek and asking, brightly, whether we had any of the rolls left from last time. I remember thinking, watching her set the bottle on the counter, that this was the last ordinary moment any of us would have together as the family we had been that morning, and some small, sentimental part of me wanted to hold on to it a little longer before I let it go. Dinner began the way it always did. Carol talked about her garden. Robert poured wine. Vanessa complimented the table setting in that particular tone she used, the one that managed to compliment and diminish in the same breath. I let the meal proceed through the appetizer and most of the main course, the way you let a fire burn down to coals before you add the final log, because timing, I had learned from Dorothy, was the entire difference between justice and chaos. When the plates were cleared and Carol rose to help me bring out dessert, I asked her to sit back down. "There's something I need to say first," I told the table, and something in my voice, calm, level, utterly without tremor, made every conversation at that table stop at once. Carol's hand froze halfway to the serving dish. Robert's wineglass paused an inch from his lips. I looked at Robert first. 11 months, I said. The Lakeshore Inn. Room charges on a credit card you opened in March and had mailed to your office, so I would never see the statement. Your mother's wedding ring, which sat in our lockbox for 11 years, waiting for a grandchild's wedding day, given away 4 months ago as, and I'm quoting one of your own messages, "Robert, something to remember this by. I have copies of everything, including the messages where you discussed how to handle the timeline so Daniel wouldn't ask questions he had every right to ask." The color left his face, the way water leaves a drain, all at once, with a sound like something being pulled away. He opened his mouth. I did not let him fill the silence. "Margaret, I can explain," he started. "You can," I said, "but not to me. You've had 11 months to explain yourself to me, Robert, and you chose silence every single time. Tonight isn't for your explanation. Tonight is for everyone else at this table to finally see what I've already seen. And you, I said, turning to Vanessa, whose smile had not yet fully collapsed, who was still, I think, operating on the assumption that an old woman in a cardigan could not possibly have assembled what I had just described. 3 weeks ago, at this table, you leaned in and called me a tacky old woman and told me you were carrying my husband's child. I laughed, because some part of me already understood something you did not yet understand about yourself. That you had made a mistake. You took a paternity test 8 weeks into your pregnancy, Vanessa. The results have been sitting in a sealed file this entire time, because you were too frightened to open them yourself, weren't you? Too frightened to find out which lie you were going to have to live with. That's not, Vanessa started, her voice climbing toward a register I had not heard from her before, something closer to panic than the practiced confidence she usually wore like a second dress. Daniel, she's lying. She doesn't know what she's. Don't, Daniel said, and the single word landed with more weight than anything else said at that table all evening. Don't you dare call my mother a liar at her own dinner table. The table had gone completely silent. Carol's hand had found mine under the tablecloth without either of us deciding to reach for the other. Daniel sat very still, his eyes fixed on Vanessa with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before, something between grief and granite. I had the results released this afternoon, I continued, and I placed a single sealed envelope on the table between the candlesticks, where it sat catching the light like something radioactive. I have not opened it. I will not open it. That is not my right. But I think everyone at this table deserves to know, right now, together, exactly what you have been hiding for 2 months, while you let an old woman believe she had nothing left to lose. Vanessa's hands were shaking when she reached for the envelope. I watched her open it with fingers that could not quite manage the simple motion of tearing paper, watched her eyes move across a single page, watched her face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not relief. Not even when the answer might have spared her marriage to my son, because by then it was already far too late for that. What crossed her face was the particular horror of a person realizing, all at once, that every calculation she had made, every lie she had told to buy herself time and protection, had been built on a foundation that was never as solid as she believed. The baby was Daniel's. I want to be honest with you about that, because I do not believe in pretending a story is simpler than it actually was for the sake of a cleaner ending. The child she carried was, in fact, my son's. But that single piece of biological truth did nothing to undo the 11 months of betrayal documented in black and white, the affair with my husband, the threats whispered at family dinners, the calculated cruelty of a young woman who had decided that an old woman's dignity was a reasonable price to pay for her own comfort. It doesn't matter, Daniel said quietly, and his voice in that silence carried further than any shout could have. It doesn't matter whose baby it is, Vanessa. You slept with my father. You let my mother sit at this table for years, lending you money, defending you to people who questioned why I was with you, and the entire time you were. He stopped. He could not finish the sentence, and I do not think he needed to. Everyone at that table understood exactly what he could not finish saying. Daniel, please, Vanessa said, and now there were tears, real ones, mixing with whatever performance had carried her through the earlier part of the evening. I made a terrible mistake, but this baby is yours. It's really yours. Doesn't that count for something? We can still. There is no we, Daniel said. There hasn't been a we for 11 months. You just made sure I didn't know it. Robert, for his part, did what men like Robert often do when the architecture of their carefully maintained life collapses all at once. He reached for blame that was not his to assign. Margaret, you had no right to investigate me, to go digging through my... I had every right, I said, and for the first time that evening, my voice rose, not into a shout, but into something with an edge that 31 years of patience had sharpened to a fine point. I built this family with you, Robert. I built your business with you, kept its books for 3 decades while you took the credit, raised your children while you worked late, gave up my own ambitions so that yours could have room to grow. I have earned the right to know the truth about the life I built. You do not get to call investigating my own marriage an overreach when you spent 11 months lying to my face in the bed we shared. "It was a mistake," Robert said, quieter now, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had risen. "Margaret, 31 years, I know that has to count for something." "It does count for something," I said. "It counts for the fact that I know exactly what this company is worth, exactly what I contributed to building it, and exactly what I am owed when this is finished. 31 years taught me everything I needed to know to walk out of this with what's mine, Robert. I suppose I should thank you for that, in a strange way." Carol broke first among the children. She is the gentler of my two, and she put her napkin down and walked out of the room, not in anger at me, but because she could not bear to watch her father's face in that moment. I found her 20 minutes later sitting on the back porch steps in the dark, knees pulled up to her chest the way she used to sit as a little girl when something at school had gone wrong. I sat down beside her without speaking at first, the way mothers learn to do, letting the silence do some of the work that words cannot. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. 3 weeks, I said. I needed to be certain before I said anything to anyone, including you. "I'm not angry you didn't tell me," Carol said. "I'm angry that this is real. I'm angry that Dad did this. I'm angry that she did this to you, specifically to you, like it was nothing, like you were nothing." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, an old, familiar gesture. "I don't know how you sat there and stayed so calm. I would have screamed the house down." "I screamed plenty," I told her. "Just not where anyone could see me. There's a difference between not feeling something and not performing it for an audience that doesn't deserve to watch you fall apart." She leaned her head against my shoulder then, the way she had not done since she was a teenager, and we sat there together for a long while, listening to the crickets, while inside the house, I imagine Robert and Daniel were having a conversation neither of them would ever fully describe to me afterward, and Vanessa was already gathering her things to leave. Daniel did not move from the table that whole time, I learned later. He sat very still, looking at Vanessa, and then he stood, slowly, and removed the ring he had given her 4 months earlier from a small velvet pouch he had. I later learned, been carrying in his pocket all evening, having suspected, on some level, that the dinner would not end with dessert. "I'll cover whatever you need for the baby," he told her, his voice flat, exhausted, final. "Lawyers will handle the rest." "But we are done, Vanessa. We have been done since the moment you decided my mother's dignity was something you could spend like pocket change." Vanessa left that night without finishing her wine, without the dessert I had spent the afternoon preparing, without the life she had clearly imagined for herself when she first calculated that marrying into a comfortable, established family was an opportunity worth securing by any means necessary. I never saw her again after that evening, except once, several months later, across a grocery store parking lot, heavily pregnant, alone, and I felt no triumph in that sight, only a quiet, tired sadness for the child who would grow up in the wreckage of choices that were never theirs to make. Robert moved out 3 days later. I did not ask him to. I did not need to. There was nothing left in our house for him to occupy. Not the bedroom, not the kitchen table where I had once kept his books by lamplight, not the marriage itself, which I came to understand, in the weeks that followed, had likely been hollowed out long before that first credit card statement ever arrived at his office instead of our home. He packed his things over a single weekend while I stayed at Carol's, and when I came home that Sunday evening to a house that felt simultaneously emptier and more entirely my own than it had in 3 decades, I sat down at the kitchen table, alone, and allowed myself, finally, to cry. Not out of grief for what I had lost, but out of something closer to exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent 3 weeks holding herself together with the discipline of a soldier and can finally, safely, put the weapon down. Priya filed the divorce paperwork the following week, built on the financial groundwork we had laid weeks earlier. And because I had documented every dollar I contributed to the growth of his business across 3 decades, the settlement reflected not what a frightened, unprepared woman might have accepted out of fear of starting over alone, but what I had actually earned through a lifetime of unpaid, uncredited labor. The negotiations were not pleasant. Robert's attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Foster who specialized, Priya told me privately, in making divorces as expensive and exhausting as possible for the spouse with less documentation, tried at first to argue that my contributions to the business were merely supportive, the kind of language, Priya explained, that lawyers use specifically to make 30 years of a woman's labor sound like. Enthusiasm rather than equity. Priya was not intimidated. She arrived at every mediation session with binders, actual binders, full of bank statements, payroll records in my handwriting going back decades, tax filings I had personally prepared, client correspondence I had personally managed. By the third session, Foster's tone had changed considerably. And by the fifth, a settlement had been reached that gave me a portion of the business equity reflecting what Priya had always insisted I deserved, along with the house, which Robert, in the end, did not have much appetite left to fight for. I will not pretend the months that followed were easy. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from losing a marriage not to death, which at least has the mercy of finality, but to betrayal, which leaves you grieving a version of your life that you eventually realize never fully existed in the way you believed it did. I grieved the version of Robert I thought I had married. I grieved 31 years I could not get back, even as I understood that getting them back was never actually what I wanted. There were nights, more than I like to admit, when I sat alone in that house and wondered whether I had imagined more affection in those 3 decades than had actually been there, whether the man who once sat with his head in his hands over a failed contract had ever truly seen me as anything more than the load-bearing wall I had so carefully, so willingly made myself into. Dorothy was there for most of those nights. More often than not, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, letting me talk in circles until I had talked myself back to something steadier. Grief doesn't care how justified your anger is, she told me once. It comes anyway. The 2 can live in the same house for a while. Doesn't mean you let the anger answer the door every time, though. But I want to tell you what I learned, because I believe it is the only part of this story that matters beyond the satisfaction of watching 2 people finally face the consequences of underestimating an old woman in a cardigan. I learned that dignity is not something other people grant you. It is something you protect, quietly, methodically, the way you protect anything valuable. Not by announcing how valuable it is, but by making sure that anyone who tries to take it discovers, too late, exactly how prepared you were to stop them. I spent 31 years being underestimated. First as a young secretary typing letters on a machine that jammed every 4th line, then as a wife whose labor was invisible because it did not have a line item on anyone's balance sheet but my own, and finally as an older woman whom a 28-year-old assumed was too frail, too foolish, or too frightened to investigate the architecture of her own life. Every single person who underestimated me was wrong, and I do not say that with pride so much as with a kind of weary clarity that I wish I had arrived at decades earlier. I also learned something harder, something I am still sitting with even now. I learned that I had, for most of my adult life, mistaken, silent endurance for strength. And I want to gently caution you, if you are listening and you recognize that same mistake in yourself, that endurance and strength are not always the same thing. Endurance is what allows you to survive a hard chapter. Strength is what allows you to finally close the book on a chapter that has stopped serving you, even when closing it costs you something you once believed was irreplaceable. I endured for 31 years. It was only in the final 3 weeks of my marriage that I finally found the strength. And I think, looking back, that the strength had been there the entire time, quietly waiting for permission I had simply never given myself before. If you are listening to this and you recognize even a small piece of yourself in my story, if you have ever sat at a table while someone you trusted made you feel small, made you feel disposable, made you feel as though your years of sacrifice were simply the cost of doing business in their life, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not required to confront cruelty the moment it happens. You are not required to scream, or to cry where they can see you, or to give anyone the satisfaction of watching you break in real time. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is exactly what I did at that dinner table the night Vanessa whispered her threat into my ear. Smile. Say, "Don't worry, dear." And then go home and begin building the proof that will, in its own time, dismantle every lie that was ever told about you. Daniel and I are closer now than we have been in years, bound together not just by blood, but by the particular intimacy that comes from surviving betrayal side by side. He shares custody of his daughter. Yes, a daughter, born 5 months after that dinner, a little girl with his same serious eyes. And I help with her on the weekends. Vanessa does not have her, not out of obligation, but because I refuse to let an innocent child inherit the consequences of her mother's choices. I rock her to sleep some evenings in a chair by my own window, and I think, watching her tiny chest rise and fall, that whatever else came out of that terrible year, this small person did not ask for any of it, and she deserves at least one grandmother who shows up steady every single time without condition. Robert and I speak only through lawyers now, and occasionally, at his request, about matters concerning the children, though even those conversations are brief, businesslike, the way you might speak to a former colleague rather than a man you once promised your entire life to. I heard, through Carol, that he and Vanessa did not last past the baby's first birthday, that whatever had drawn them together in secret for 11 months had very little left to sustain it once it was no longer secret, once it had cost both of them everything it eventually cost. I take no pleasure in that information. I simply note it, the way I have learned to note most things now, quietly, without comment, filed away in a ledger that belongs only to me. I want to tell you something else, something I have not yet said, because I think it explains where whatever strength I found that year actually came from. My own mother, Ruth, raised 5 children alone in a small town 2 hours from here after my father left when I was 9 years old, taking with him most of what little money the family had and leaving behind a debt at the local hardware store that took her 3 years to pay off, $1 or $2 at a time, cleaning houses on weekdays and taking in laundry on weekends. I remember her sitting at our own kitchen table, much smaller and much more worn than the one I would later own, doing arithmetic by lamplight long after we children were supposed to be asleep. And I remember asking her once, when I was perhaps 11, whether she was ever afraid. "Of course I'm afraid," she told me, not looking up from her figures. Being afraid and being foolish are 2 different things, Margaret. A foolish woman lets her fear make her decisions for her. A frightened woman who still knows how to count her own money is the most dangerous thing in this world to anyone who underestimates her. She passed away when I was 43, never having remarried, never having needed to. And I think of that sentence more often than almost anything else she ever told me, especially in the weeks after that dinner, especially on the nights when fear tried to convince me that what I was doing was too bold, too cold, too unlike the quiet, agreeable woman everyone had always assumed I was. I was not being cold. I was being my mother's daughter, finally, fully, at 68 years old, doing arithmetic by lamplight to protect what was mine. There is a particular kind of company I keep with women who came from mothers like mine, the kind of women who learned, early and without ceremony, that softness and weakness are not the same thing, that you can be gentle with everyone in your life and still keep a ledger no one else is permitted to see. I think Dorothy recognized that quality in me before I fully recognized it in myself, which is perhaps why she trusted me with Frank's name and Priya's name so readily, without hesitation, the way you hand a tool to someone you already know how to use it. The business transition, once the divorce settlement was finalized, took several more months to complete. Robert had wanted, at first, to simply sell his half outright and walk away entirely. But Priya advised against accepting a quick, undervalued offer simply for the sake of speed, and I am glad I listened. We brought in an independent appraiser, a meticulous, soft-spoken man named Mr. Okafor, who spent 2 full weeks combing through 30 years of records. Many of them I noted with some private satisfaction in my own handwriting, before arriving at a final valuation that confirmed everything Priya had told me in our second meeting. I ultimately retained a meaningful stake in the company itself, enough that Robert's eventual full retirement, 2 years later, meant the business passed not to a stranger or a competitor, but partially into a structure I had helped design, with Daniel, who had always had a sharper head for structural integrity than his father gave him credit for, eventually stepping in as a silent advisor on the engineering side of major commercial contracts. I do not say any of this to suggest that the story ended with me running an electrical contracting company at 69 years old, sitting behind some grand desk with my name freshly painted on a door. That is not who I am, and it was never the point. The point was simpler than that, and I think more useful to you, whoever you are, listening to this in whatever kitchen or car or quiet room you find yourself in tonight. The point was that I finally understood, fully and without doubt, exactly what I had built, exactly what it was worth, and exactly what I was owed when someone tried to take it from me without my consent. I planted roses along the back fence the first spring I lived there, the kind that take 3 years to truly establish themselves, and I think of them sometimes as a kind of quiet metaphor I do not need to explain to anyone but myself. That some of the most beautiful things in a life take the longest to bloom, and that patience, the same patience that once felt like a cage, can become, with time and the right soil, something closer to freedom. There is a moment, just before bedtime, when my granddaughter. Daniel named her June, after no one in particular, simply because he said it sounded like warmth. Reaches up and pats my cheek with one small hand, the way babies do when they are deciding whether a face belongs to someone safe. I think every single time she does it, of the dinner table where all of this began, of a much younger woman's whisper meant to make me feel small, and I think about how strange it is that something so cruel eventually led, through 3 weeks of quiet work and a lifetime of accumulated patience, to this particular piece. A grandmother in a small house with a garden, rocking a child who will never know the worst of what happened, only the steadiness of the people who chose, in the end, to stay. Carol still comes by most Sundays, and we cook together now the way I once cooked alone, trading stories about her own life, her own small frustrations and joys, the ordinary fabric of a family that has, against the odds, come out the other side of something that could easily have unraveled it entirely instead. Dorothy and I still sit on her back porch most summer evenings, though these days the conversation is lighter, gardens and grandchildren, and the occasional gossip about the neighborhood. The heavy work of those 3 weeks long behind us, filed away the way everything eventually gets filed away, not forgotten, simply no longer urgent. I do not know what Robert tells people now, about the marriage, about the divorce, about the daughter-in-law who was never quite his daughter-in-law at all. I have stopped wondering. There is a particular freedom that comes from no longer needing to manage what someone else thinks of you. A freedom I did not fully understand until I was 68 years old and finally allowed myself to claim it. If there is one thing I would want you to carry with you from everything I have told you tonight, it is this. The people who underestimate you are not always wrong because they misjudge your strength. Sometimes they are wrong because they misjudge your patience, mistaking it for permission, mistaking your silence for surrender. I was never silent because I had nothing to say. I was silent because I was listening, watching, building, the way my own mother taught me to build, one careful figure at a time, by lamplight, for as long as it took. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.